Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living world and with the great mystery that runs through us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and daring natures, bringing together the expansive minds, topics, and ideas that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we wish to thrive in.
Grief and love are so intertwined. In fact, they are in some ways relational to each other, to the extent that the more we're able to feel grief and sorrow, the more we're able to feel joy and love and wonder. And when I started to understand that as almost like an expansion in all directions, it became really clear to me why it had felt so uncomfortable to try and move on from my grief.
I am joined with the beautiful Nici Harrison, who is a grief tender, transformational coach and the founder of the Grief Space, which invites nurturing reverence for grief, loss, and ultimately life itself. Nici hosts grief circles, retreats, workshops, individual sessions, and an apprenticeship program, recognizing that now, more than ever, the world needs to remember the lost art of grief tending, so that we may all open our hearts fully to life and use grief as a beautiful gateway for transformation. I met Nici at an ancestral drum making workshop with Dory Joy, who, side note, I have another podcast episode coming up with. And Nici, she really is someone I want to have in my life as a friend and guide. I found this conversation so moving, and I'm just, grateful that there's someone like Nici holding these deeply needed spaces for grief tending. Nici, it's so wonderful to have you here, opening this discussion about your work and the beautiful, really needed topic of grief tending. I loved our day together making drums with Dory Joy, and sitting in your presence and company was just wonderful. And so I've been very drawn to you and what you're doing in this world, and I'm very excited to dive into this conversation with you now. Can you briefly speak to the broad spectrum of grief, just in case anyone is making the assumption that we're only speaking of bereavement?
Thank you, Ronnie, and so grateful and excited to be here with you. It feels nourishing already. And yes, very important question up front, because I'd love for this conversation to feel welcoming and inviting to everyone listening. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about is how universal grief is. And when we talk about grief, naturally a lot of people think about bereavement and death of someone that we love. And of course, that is a huge, huge grief and a huge loss. But actually, grief and grief tending allows us the invitation to think about grief in its broadest sense. So that tangible examples of things that we've lost, whether that's someone or it's a relationship that's ended, parts of ourselves as we're growing older, our health in many ways, our hopes, the expectations that we had for our lives. And then there's also the more subtle elements of grief, which is the parts of ourselves that have not known love, or often that grief which we can't name or point to, but it's a longing for connection, for community, for meaning, for a way of being in the world that allows us to feel our interconnectedness. And I think there's a huge unnamed collective grief in that at the moment. And as I said as well, collective grief, the ones that we can see and the ones we can name, social injustice, the climate crisis, collective loss and longing. But then also this feeling of uncertainty. I think throughout the global experience of COVID, there is, for many, the recognition that we're in an initiation, a transformation, and there is a huge amount of grief just being an alive human being in these times, whether we have the language around that or not. There is a grief that needs seeing and a grief that needs tending to. So yeah, I guess my hope is, as you're listening to this, to give yourself full permission to name the different parts of your grief, because that is the very first step in allowing grief to move through us and to change, is to name it and to welcome it.
I love that so much. And yeah, through discovering your work, I have discovered Francis Weller and his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which I know has had a huge impact on your life. And I'm in the middle of reading it now. And it's, oh my goodness, it is moving the deepest depths of my being. It's really speaking to my soul. And it's, yeah, I've been reading it. I've been getting more and more excited for this conversation with you, because we really need more people tending to this part of our experience. I felt almost overwhelmed with relief, actually, just discovering you and Francis Weller, and discovering that there's spaces for people to gather in their grief and to have this specific support available. And it baffles me it's not more commonly practiced and more integrated into our society. And so I would love it if you could speak about your personal journey into this work and how it has led you to cultivate this deeply needed community of grief tending.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a personal initiation that led me to this grief tending work. For whatever reason, it's been my walk in this life to walk closely and have grief as a close companion. I was in my sort of late teens when my dearest mum, who was a real kind of soul sister and a true guide and friend, as well as being my mum, started to suffer from a really deep depression, which took her away from me and us as a family in a way that at the time I had no language around. So there was a huge grief in losing her, even though her physical being was still here. And then sadly, the depression took her really deeply, and she died when I was 22. She took her own life. And it was the deepest invitation into really being with what it means to be human that I could have ever been given the opportunity to encounter and to sit with. And all I knew in my being at that time, even though I was completely lost and overwhelmed and without guidance or support or language, all I knew in my being was grief was something that I wanted to walk towards rather than away from. It was almost a calling to me to allow myself to kind of journey into the murky depths of it. And I knew that actually there was nowhere else I wanted to be. So whereas really understanding friends and family were maybe encouraging a kind of invitation to rebuild and to look forward, I was being drawn again and again into the depths of grief. So kind of inviting myself to journey into different therapy practices, different body work, retreats, all in a way to try and help me make sense of this new landscape that I found myself in. And somewhere within that, I started to talk about this experience of grief with friends and friends of friends. And it was actually an acupuncturist, wonderful woman, Maya, who said to me, you know what you're doing? You're holding grief circles. You're bringing the topic of grief in a kind of safe and held space, even though at that time it was really informal. And she introduced me to this book you just mentioned, Frances Weller's The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And I read the entire book in one night. And as you said, it completely spoke to my soul, to my heart, to my being. And it's been a long journey over many years of piecing together this forgotten language of grief tending that changed my whole life, that gave me permission to feel, before the narrative had been, at some point it will get better and at some point you will get over this, in an essence of trying to fix me. And actually what grief tending does in a lot of Frances Weller's work and many other beautiful teachers is this full permission to allow and welcome grief. In fact, to say there are some things in life you never get over, but you can integrate them into your being in a way that feels balanced and true, and then you can move forward and walk in life with the experience of grief and loss and sorrow being a part of who you are. And it's really no surprise, because grief tending had such a wild impact on me, that there is now nothing else that I could possibly do except try and share the concept and I say the language a lot, because it's the permission to look at grief in a different way. And it's really my heart's path now to hold grief spaces, to talk about grief with beautiful people that feel called to share this discussion with me, and to continuously learn. I'm so humbled constantly by this work. We've really lost it in our culture today, so I'm looking forward to continuously learning and evolving my practice of grief tending, which never has a completion.
Yeah, I feel so much emotion just moving through me, just sitting in this conversation, because it's like this deep recognition of like, yes, I need this part of myself to be seen, and yes, I see you, I hear you in such an intimate way. I was reading in the book about the ancient Scandinavian practice of grief tending, where you would be you wouldn't need to gather food, you wouldn't need to take part in any of the normal communal practices, and you were just allowed to walk and be still and be deep with this process for maybe even a year, because it was recognized that when you came back to the community, that you would enrich the community with that deep reflection and process, and become the type of elder who can really nourish the community as well, which I just think is so beautiful.
Yeah, goosebumps.
Yeah, I want to cover a few parts of grief, and you spoke briefly to this collective grief we're all feeling with the planet and social injustice, but before we dive into that, I do want to speak a bit about bereavement. And you wrote fairly recently that there is a similarity, sorry, this is your quote, there is a similarity between people who have been bereaved as young adults, a tension between the part of us that feels left behind and the part of us that feels way ahead, heavy, more reflective and less free. And I feel we've all experienced grief, although of course some do experience these more major losses earlier in life than others. And I'm reflecting on my own experiences of this type of bereavement grief. And I've had cancer young, when I was 20, and through that process made some beautiful friends. And we did a tour around the UK singing and fundraising for a cancer charity. And one of the friends, George, the cancer just came back really suddenly. He got an infection and he died, and it all happened very quickly. And when you're young, and when it's someone who's passing before a kind of more older natural death, it really did distance me from my peers. And it's only with hindsight that I can see that the people who were really able to hold space for me in that time were people who had also experienced early bereavement and grief. it's almost, and it wasn't even through their language or through their communication, it was through this sort of soul to soul presence. And so this might be a little abstract or complex to answer, but I would love to explore what the relationship is between grief and the soul, between grief and a deeper essence of existence or consciousness, and how this deepest depth of feeling brings us closer.
Yeah, thank you. And honouring you and your journey just for a moment. Thank you for sharing that. I think it is Francis Weller, I probably quote him every day of my life, who says that grief work is soul work. And whatever that word means to you, for some it can have a huge resonance, and for others it can alienate. But for me, I see soul and spirituality and spirit as this kind of intimacy with life. And the way that grief is a beautiful invitation into this intimacy of what it really means to be alive is that we are touching that essence of the fragility of our human life. We're touching that thin veil, that essence, that kind of that line that we're all dancing between death and life, between love and loss, between death and rebirth. And I think when we are in a space of grief, we feel that expansion and the polarity and the paradox more acutely. I've spoken with hundreds of people now in different experiences of grief, and there is this commonality of aliveness that can sometimes accompany grief when it's raw. In some ways we get stripped of the mundane, we are stripped of all that doesn't matter, whether that's our careers, whether that's the day-to-day busyness. And within that is the invitation to come back to what really matters. And within that is, I think, is where we are given the opportunity to meet our soul, ourselves, something that resembles spirituality, nature, meaning, purpose, connection, community. It's a deep invitation to ask those questions that make us feel at once expansive and also minuscule. It's an invitation for me to be with the very questions that make living worthwhile. Life is only precious and beautiful and full of wonder because there is death. And so often we don't allow that recognition into our being in any way. And so to allow grief to really break us open, I think, is an invitation to feel closer to the soul, closer to spirit, closer to a deeper way of living and being.
I love the way you're communicating all of this. I think it's, I'm just really enjoying this conversation so much. And to follow on from that, this is much of the same thing, but you have written that in the Guatemalan Tutsuji language, the word for grief and praise are the same, because you can only grieve what you have dearly loved. And you've written, it is also with this awareness that grief becomes something that we learn to embrace, something we can integrate into all of who we are, end quote. And then obviously Francis Weller, he speaks about this. I would love to read this quote. Grief and love are sisters, woven together from the beginning. Their kinship reminds us that there is no love that does not contain loss, and no loss that is not a reminder of the love we carry for what we have once held close. And so there's this deep, duality and this experience of like the depths of the grief and the sorrow and the absolute depths of the love and joy, and how we can, if you can speak to how we can really celebrate and integrate all of it rather than bypassing the emotions that have been socially quote unquote unuseful.
Yeah, this was my biggest surprise gift, and also something I've known all along that came with my experience of understanding grief tending, was this recognition, as you've just described, that grief and love are so intertwined. In fact, they are in some ways relational to each other, to the extent that the more we're able to feel grief and sorrow, the more we're able to feel joy and love and wonder. And when I started to understand that as almost like an expansion in all directions, it became really clear to me why it had felt so uncomfortable to try and move on from my grief in my sort of early 20s, and my experience of trying to piece my life back together, because I recognized somewhere in me that holding the grief, keeping it close and letting myself continuously feel it was also my gateway into feeling close to life. When I experienced experiments with trying to kind of move forward in a way that allowed me to let go of my grief, so I did a brief sort of less than a year in a very corporate job, I felt myself contract, and I noticed that yes, I wasn't feeling so much of the grief on a day-to-day basis, but I wasn't feeling very alive at all. And that's where I've started to take that experience that I had personally and look around me. And what breaks my heart is so many of us, understandably, have shut ourselves off from feeling grief and sorrow and loss and longing and hardship because we haven't been taught, we haven't been shown, we're not supported, and it's too painful. But as we've been talking about, as you've described, because grief and love are so intertwined, what we don't realize as a collective is in shutting ourselves off from grief, we are shutting ourselves off from love and joy in a deep and meaningful way. And I think that's why we're seeing an epidemic of people trying to find that joy and that love and that wonder in shopping, in partying, in their careers. There is this kind of need and hunger to feel alive. And I'm curious about what it would do to our systems, to our cultures, to our schools, to our workplaces, to our communities, if we welcomed in grief and loss and longing. Would that free something up within us that led to a more organic and spontaneous and internal sense of joy from within, rather than what we're seeing so often is this search for joy and happiness and love without, from the external world?
Yes. That makes me want to read about what human biologist Paul Shepard said. The grief and sense of loss that we often interpret as failure in our own personality is actually a feeling of emptiness where a beautiful and strange otherness should have been encountered, end quote. And this makes so much sense to me. You know, I've craved, there's been a point where childhood was just magical and explorative and playful and joyful and deep and diverse. And there was a point where it kind of got dulled into this normality, into, societal expectations and pressures, and the mundane of everyday life is what I think we're all kind of suffering from in some way, and we're lacking that mystery in connection with the land, with the animals, with seeing the birds fly overhead and them have some sort of deep symbolic meaning to the community, and having elders and story. And yeah, what you just spoke to, it just feels like this kind of, anxiety and depression and boredom or whatever else that's moving through us is just this unanswered symptom of this lack of beauty and otherness.
Yeah. And if I could just reflect back on that, Ronnie, because it touches something that is really increasingly important to me, is how do we bring everything that you've just described to the many? Because I've been through different periods of my life where I've dipped in and out of different spiritual practices and communities that do have a language around intimacy with the land, with nature, with community. But in some ways it can be very alienating to many people in our culture, in mainstream culture. And that makes me really sad, because as you've just described, like, so much of the sorrow and the malaise and the grief, although it might not be named that way, that every day all of us feel, is actually this longing for something magical and mysterious and beautiful, but that we can't name. And I think there's such an opportunity within grief work to bridge, and I kind of don't like putting it in boxes in this way because no one is one or the other, but kind of bridge the spirituality with the mainstream in a way that a lot of practices within kind of more spiritual or alternative communities kind of struggle to do so. And much like maybe yoga has done in terms of being a kind of gentle invitation to anybody to be with themselves, to slow down, to be with the breath, I wonder, and I'm excited about how grief circles, because grief is universal, it touches everyone, could be this really inclusive way of helping people to be with the experience of community. I had a conversation just this morning with a friend who does different kind of coaching and retreat offerings, and she recognized that actually quite often people come together in a group and experience maybe a breathwork practice or a yoga practice or a sharing circle, and that happens to be in community, and they recognize the benefit of being in community as well. But she started to go through this process of, maybe it's not the breathwork, maybe it's not the yoga, maybe it's not the sharing, maybe the community is the medicine, the coming together, the witnessing, the being seen. And that for me feels so exciting because it's so simple. It's relatively free for a lot of people. It's accessible and it's inclusive, and my heart just has this really strong resonance of coming back to the circle, the community, space to be seen and space to see, as being deep medicine for these times.
Yeah. That is such a valid point, because I dance between these different worlds, and I've also spent time dipping into various different communities, or quote unquote conscious communities, and there is quite a strong divide between a sense of aloofness sometimes and disattachment from the rest of the world in spaces like that, and then also being in the world and people really immersed in some really complex parts of human existence and society, and doing this work and not having that same kind of invitation to sit in circle and to be together. And you're so right. I think when I got into yoga, I was really going because there was a room full of people all doing the same thing, all breathing together, making sounds together. I recently went to a studio when I was passing through London, and I was the only one there who turned up, and there was someone there on a big screen on Zoom, and my heart sank because That's, I guess, not why I go. And you're so right with this, to have these accessible spaces. And you've spoken really to what I was about to ask next, which is, I feel like the human experience is so deeply enriched with sharing and story and intimate spaces and coming together in circle. And I'm curious how you think we might be able to bring this to the masses, to the children, to the elders, to everyone.
It is so accessible and replicable. I think that's the beauty of it. On an individual, personal level, it's a case of talking about these circles in every situation I find myself in, whether that is a conversation I know where it'll land well, or a conversation where people might be a little bit more uncertain, and sharing the medicine and as far as and as wide as I can, in a way that's still sustainable and nourishing. And it's funny that you mention the children, because I feel like in some ways they sort of know how to do this already. So it's interesting what you said about that point in your childhood when it went from being free and magical and full of mystery and connection to fitting into the mundane and the kind of the normal societal structures, I suppose. So I wonder for children, and there's so much beautiful work going on, but how do we protect and keep the spaces and the container strong to keep that magic alive for as long as possible? And then in terms of where this, like how far this could go, I don't think I'm being too bold to say that circles could be embedded into every sort of community or systemic structure that we have, whether that is the schoolroom, whether that is a religious community, whether that's the workplace, team meetings, whether that's the way that we gather, even after a yoga class. Wouldn't it be beautiful to have half an hour of sharing afterwards, so that we have that experience of being seen and see one another? But it starts small. I think there was definitely a process for me anyway of it feeling a little clunky to start with. I feel like I've spent a decade removing layers of my conditioning. So I think it kind of came through in what I was just saying. I'm really passionate about how do we make these spaces feel inclusive to anyone. And I think that's the only way we're going to make coming together in community and circle more common, is to make these spaces where people feel really welcomed and really comfortable, whether it's something they've done before or never heard of. So to start small, there are open circles increasingly. There's lots of women's circles popping up around, which I'd encourage anyone to kind of find and look for in your local community. But myself and there's a small little group of grief tenders in the UK are holding more and more open events. So once you know that language, grief tending, you can type it in and see if there's something near you. Certainly if you're in London, really welcome you to come to some of the spaces that I hold in collaboration with lots of other space holders.
Yes, we need more of you spreading these beautiful circles and creating these spaces. But I totally share your vision. I can really see systemic structures taking up these circles and this practice and recognizing it. I can really picture, I'm sure some teachers have probably already done it, children gathering around and tending to what they're sad about, because I know that for children, children who are connected and see the state of the world at the moment, I think are incredibly anxious. yeah, I think we need this space for the processing and for the connection.
We do. And, you mentioned the state of the world. I mean, something that, just to share, I guess, my vulnerability, it's something that I kind of dip a toe in and then I recoil out of insecurity, but we desperately need grief tending spaces for our planet, for the climate, and for what we've done as individuals and as a collective, knowingly or unknowingly, because there's so much beautiful focus on action right now, which, given our time frame, is critical. But I wonder if there is a kind of, to that yang, we need the opposite, the yin, of slowing down and really deeply honouring our grief and asking for forgiveness and saying that we're sorry and letting that repair our connection with nature. It's something that I think about often because myself, and I think so many daren't hold those spaces out of fear of it not being perfect and being a complete hypocrite, because we all are. Most of us are in the systems that we live in, but it's something that I feel we desperately need, because only when we allow something to really permeate our hearts and break our hearts, it's at that point that we can kind of alchemize it into action and into conscious, deliberate intent of how we want to move forward. I think we need both, but it hasn't been much of the conversation of the climate crisis. We're speaking at the time when COP's just finished, and there's been no acknowledgement of how do we grieve for what we've done and grieve for what we've lost, and for the communities that are most harmed, and how do we say sorry? I'm not sure. I think it's a Tibetan prayer, but I would need to check. But a teacher of mine, Fiona Arrigo, she says, if there's one prayer that we say continuously, it's thank you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you. Thank you, I'm sorry, please forgive me, I love you. And I think we need to bring that way of grieving to our collective grief about the planet at this time.
Oh, I totally agree. And what's coming through for me is this, the body of the earth and how it really is our body. And this sorrow and this neglect of the earth, I can see it also in our bodies and in the human body. And I just want to read what cellist Glendinning calls earth grief. She writes, quote, "To open our hearts to the sad history of humanity and the devastated state of the earth is the next step in our reclamation of our bodies, the body of our human community and the body of the earth." End quote. And it feels in this moment like a really clear answer to bringing people together and connecting us deeply, allowing that recognition and sorrow to come. Because whether it is consciously or unconsciously, we are, there's no way we can't be feeling it. I think you've spoken a lot to this already, and I think it's what we're talking about is actually a very healthy way to address this collective grief. And for anyone who might need this guidance and wants to be involved sooner rather than later, I believe you have some online offerings. Is your apprenticeship online or in person?
Currently the next one's online.
Tell us about that and the journey that is, and what that might feel and look like if someone wanted to go through that process.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a really wild, interesting journey moving a lot of this work online in the last year. But it's actually been really beautiful because I've been able to connect to people all around the world and offer people the chance to do this journey from the comfort and the safety of their own home, which has actually been really nourishing. But the apprenticeship with grief that I offer, and that's starting again in January, is a 3-month journey through the elemental wisdom of earth, water, fire, air, and their connection with grief. And it's a blend of circles and then also individual sessions with me, just to really integrate the experience and kind of have that space to go a bit deeper. And it's always really cozy and beautiful. And even though, I was laughing the other day about how I call them grief circles, but really they're love circles. There's so much love in these spaces. It's lovely having the 3 months for everyone just to let their nervous system settle into feeling safe and feeling like they can share and be seen. And the journey with the elements kind of really maps out that invitation to at first kind of be held, feel the ground, to feel safe, to feel at home within ourselves as we journey through the earth. The water is the invitation to be deeply allowing of the felt sense, to welcome emotions, to honor sensitivity, to imagine our grief like a river kind of flowing through us. And then as we move into the fire, it's all about what is being burnt away, what is being revealed, what are you being invited to let go of, what is your kind of inner flame of truth. Or deep teachers of mine, Xochi, Balfour and Ajay Kadden, they say, what are you a torchbearer for? What are you carrying? What are you holding? And then as we move into the air, kind of similar to much of this conversation, actually, it's how does grief invite an invitation to touch the mystery, to allow yourself to welcome all that cannot be seen and to fall back into trust. So we kind of go on this deep inquiry into the ways that grief is changing us and how we can feel it. And then it's at the end, it's almost like letting that all go and falling into trust, which is a scary thing to do if you've had a huge grief and a huge loss in your life, to actually invite yourself to fall back into trust and surrender again. But it's it's close to my heart, this journey, and I would love to do it in person, but things are continuously changing, so I'm hesitant to do a kind of 3-month thing in person right now, and instead I'll be doing lots of one-off events, sort of day-long retreats in London and things.
Beautiful. It sounds amazing. I'm genuinely considering joining it just to allow some space to really work through so much unattended grief that I think I carry, and a lot of it is, about the world and the collective density of what is always happening. And I have to protect my mental health in many ways by not reading the news every day. And it's finding this balance between being informed, being aware, knowing when and how to act or contribute, but also really harnessing my personal bubble of what in a world before media, what would naturally be there, what would be the sort of information I would naturally be receiving. Because if I go one way or the other too much, it can I can feel either too disconnected or too overwhelmed. And then also just writing these questions for this interview has really reminded me or made me realize how I never tended that grief about George, and I've lost other friends young as well, just from knowing people from this illness. And it sits in the body, doesn't it? It's our body is storing these things, our mind is putting them in little neat places at the end of neural pathways somewhere, and something can bring it up. And I think it's really beautiful to share space and allow it to come up in a safe space and not in an unexpected way further down the line. So thank you for talking talking me through that, because it sounds beautiful. I love working with the elements as well. A lot of the gatherings with rooted healing are working through the different elements. There's so much wisdom to be had from each one. Oh, yeah, this has all been so beautiful. I have a question that's come up, and this might be a bit of an odd one. But when you're holding these spaces, and grief is this universal thing, I'm curious how it interacts across different belief systems. Because when I was grieving George, I called a friend who was in that small group because I so desperately needed to speak with someone who understood. And we had a difficult conversation because she's very religious, very Christian. And at the time, I've always been really open and curious, but I really didn't know what I believed. And I certainly didn't have any attach myself to any Christian values. And I remember that our conversation was almost blocked in the grief around that. I'm just curious if that's ever come up for you.
Yeah, I mean, reflecting, I think one of the things that the grief circles offer is a way to be with grief, to be with loss, to be with life, that touches on spirituality, that touches on the essence of what many religions are, I suppose, cultivating and nurturing within us. But it's not wedded to any particular language or belief system. So interestingly, I find I don't get very many people in my spaces who have strong religious views that they share anyway with me. But what I do get a lot of is a lot of maybe more secular people coming, remarking on how this feels like a relief to come to a place that feels sacred, but that is so inclusive and accessible. There is a lot that I do in the background, I guess, to try and create a space that is sacred, and whatever that word means to you. But I will take some time to make sure that my mind is clear, my heart is open. I'll make the space around me look beautiful, even if that's just lighting a candle, having a little bowl of water, and really honouring this as a place where we come to meet that deeper connection with life. So it's interesting, and maybe I never really thought about it this way, but maybe that's what I'm doing for myself. I create this space for myself as well. I love sitting in circle in a way that connects me to that which is beyond myself.
You're so beautiful. It's just so wonderful to hear you speak about this work, and I'm very grateful that you're doing this work. It's so needed. I would love to ask you, and you've touched upon this so much in your answers already, but when you center in your heart space and vision a future and a way where we're all going, we're all present with for us and for future generations to come, what is your hope, your prayers, your ideas that you'd like to project into word so that we may join you to finish this conversation?
Thank you, Ronnie. That's beautiful. And I have to speak really honestly that it's something that I've had a tough time with lately. In some ways, I feel like we are so deep in the kind of the darkness before hopefully the dawn, that on many moments I can't vision something that feels tangible. And actually, I said to you at the beginning of this conversation, I'm just about to go away for a month and a half, or I'm taking myself away from my work. And a big part of that is to reconnect to my vision, to my hope for humanity, and to feel that in my body, because I admit that for the last couple of years I have been kind of in this birth canal of bringing this grief work, and I would love to spend more time rooting deep within myself of, okay, and what's the long-term future that I'm imagining for my children and their children and their children's children. If I could put a few words to it now, but as I said, I need to embody this. It feels a little bit far away. It is a space where everybody feels like they belong and that they know their innate connection to community, to the land, to the earth, and to themselves. It's a place where each person's unique gift is nourished and nurtured, and it's the responsibility of all to bring forth everybody's light into the world so that we're not walking around feeling insecure and inadequate. It is a place where work and the economy, or whatever you want to name it, is filled with joy and ease and abundance. It's a place where creativity and connection and community are prioritized. And it's a place where we can honor loss, where we can, as you said, that beautiful Scandinavian invitation that when somebody goes through loss, which is inevitable, that we carve out a way of holding, supporting, nourishing, and allowing it to run its course rather than being cut short. It's a place where people can be all that they are and share all that they feel. Yeah, and I feel a bit tearful because we feel a really long way away from that.
Yeah, I like to ask this question because I think there's a part of me that so desperately wants to hear that we're all wanting the same things, we're all there holding this vision. And it is daunting and it is overwhelming, and there is this sense of, gosh, are we going to make it, Are we going to be able to find this deep sense of belonging for everyone? And in some ways I feel like that's what it's all about. We all just want to belong. And you can see this play out in the human experience with all the things we create, the groups, the cults, just we're all trying to create a way to belong with each other, with place, with and a big part of that has also not included the land and the living world that we are a part of. And I just want to keep holding the vision, and we can just all keep doing what we're doing, the work that you're contributing to the world and to community is so, so important. And I hope that anyone listening to this is going to feel inspired. How can we create community? How can we create space for people to process what needs to be processed and to feel what we really ought to be feeling and not suppressing, and allowing these things to move. So thank you for answering that so vulnerably and beautifully and honestly. And I feel you, and I feel this whole conversation has just filled me with this tender, moving emotion that I feel is medicine. And I so want to be in a space with people to work through this and to release this and to, bring ritual, bring ceremony, bring presence to it. So this has been amazing. You're incredible. Is there anything you would like to navigate people to that I can link in the show notes? before we round off this conversation?
Thank you. My work is The Grief Space. You can find that just thegriefspace.com or at The Grief Space on Instagram. And I really welcome people reaching out, sharing their reflections. And if anybody knows other people doing this work, I would love any recommendations. I'm continuously trying to build this community of people that want to talk about grief. Ronnie, you're in it now. And just to reflect back to you all of the beautiful work that you're doing in the world and your vision and that strong leadership that you're holding and gathering people together and their stories. And I'm really grateful to have connected. I've actually got the drum sitting on my desk right next to me that we made together. And I feel very, very grateful to have started this friendship, and I'm curious to see where our paths and our work and our being in the world overlaps. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being here with the Rooted Healing community. Speaking of the power of people coming together to really go deep and explore the very essence of who we are, we have a magical gathering coming up in Mexico called Soul Medicine, which is an intimate exploration of ceremonial healing, ritual and workshops, beautiful community in the abundant jungle near San Pancho. If this is something that calls to you, you can find out more at rootedhealing.org/soulmedicine. The relevant links to this episode are in the show notes, and if you've enjoyed this conversation, please do share it with your friends and family. Rate, review, subscribe. You know how important that is, especially as we're a new podcast. And follow us on social media. Perhaps even consider becoming a patron from as little as $1 a month, where you'll receive exclusive content and you'll help us continue with this podcast. To find out more about our work, upcoming gatherings and other offerings, please visit rootedhealing.org. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell, and I'd just like to finish by saying, thank you for the beautiful medicine you bring to this world, in whatever capacity that is.